Greetings, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have you all here for the launch of our Colonies Conscious, Collective Minds and Philosophical Implications, published by Fee Press. My name is Luis, and I co-edited the book with Anderson Fonseca. This book was conceived with a simple but profound question at its core, which was the research problem of Anderson's master's thesis. Can a collective, such as an ant colony, truly be conscious? From there, we try to expand this idea, asking what such a possibility would mean for our understanding of mind, subjectivity, and the boundaries of individual experience. From its inception, the project sought to bring together diverse perspectives on the possibility of collective consciousness, a topic that challenges both our philosophical intuitions and our scientific frameworks. To explore that, we brought together researchers from different perspectives. While many contributions adopt a naturalistic and biologically grounded approach, others turn toward more classical human-centered interpretations, exploring the anthropological and experiential dimensions of what it means to be conscious together. Over the course of this launch event, which takes place on November 17 and 18, 2025, the authors will present their respective contributions to the volume. We invite you to engage directly with them, to ask questions, raise objections, and explore together the many conceptual and empirical challenges that this topic entails. Anderson and I would like to thank the graduate program in philosophy at the Federal University of Mato Grosso, which helped fund the publication with the support of CAPES, the Brazilian Federal Agency for Support and Evaluation of Graduate Education. A very special thanks goes to Professor João de Fernandes Teixeira, a pioneer in the philosophy of mind in Brazil. We are truly honored that he wrote the preface for this book. Specifically regarding this event, we also would like to thank the Federal University of the Southern Frontier and GEMA, the research group on the philosophy of animal minds, for their institutional support. And we also want to express and register our gratitude to the very special session hosts, Marco Aurelio Alves, Guilherme Ghisoni, and Victor Barcelos, whom you will meet throughout these 2 days of the event. Finally, a very, very special thank you to all the contributors for this insightful work, and to all of you for being here to share this occasion with us. Thank you and welcome to our Ant Colonies Conference. We begin this event with a session that takes us straight to the heart of the book's central question, not only whether an ant colony could be conscious, but how we might begin to understand or even study such phenomena. I am very pleased to open this first session by introducing a very special host. Please join me in welcoming Professor Marco Aurelio Alves, who will be moderating this session, presentations, and Q&A. Professor Marco Aurelio Alves is currently based at the Federal University of São João del Rei. He holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Texas and is one of Brazil's leading figures in philosophy of mind. We are truly delighted to have Professor Marco Aurelio chairing this session. Professor, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you. First, I want to thank myself, your invitation to be here, moderating this first session of this event. I think this book is a unique contribution to the literature in Portuguese and philosophy of mind. So for all of us teaching philosophy of mind in Brazil, this book is one of a kind. I don't know of any other book that put together that many leading philosophers in the area, and with a specific focus on collective minds, which is something that it's unheard of in Portuguese. I don't know. So it's such an important tool to all of us teaching philosophy in Brazil. So I want to thank you and Anderson for all the work of organizing this book and putting this event together. It's an immense pleasure to be here and to to get it started, this event, which I take to be a celebration of the publication of the book. So I want to introduce our speakers, and we're going to switch the order. So if you are here watching us, please be aware that Luke Roelofs is going to be first, and then Daniel Friedman is going to come second. I'm going to, the first presentation, so it's going to be, is entitled, What is it like to be an ant colony? By Luke Roelofs, who is an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Texas at Arlington. Writes about metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics of consciousness. They studied philosophy and psychology at the University of Oxford, then completed the PhD in philosophy at the University of Toronto, 2015. After that, took postdoctoral positions at the Australian National University, University Bochum in Germany, and New York University. You're welcome, Luke. And the second presentation, entitled Towards a Science of Consciousness and Social Complexity for Ants, by Daniel Friedman and Maria Luiza Iennaco, who is not here. So Daniel is going to be presenting it on his own. Daniel Friedman is researcher in biology, art, philosophy, cognitive security, active inference, ants, systems, community, and complexity. It's quite a lot of stuff. I assume you have been busy. Currently, he is the president of the Institute for Active Inference. He has a bachelor's degree in sciences, University of California, PhD in biology from Stanford University, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California until 2023. Daniel's primary training and research focus on entomology. So it's really a pleasure to have you both here. And let's start with without further ado, let's get it started. The floor is yours, Luke.
Luis, Marco, Anderson. I'm gonna share my screen and start a slideshow. Are people able to see my slides now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I am gonna talk in perhaps slightly speculative philosophical fashion about what it might be like to be an ant colony. If on the supposition that there is anything, what might we be able to say about it? And so my plan of the talk is pretty simple. I'll start by saying a little bit just about that kind of presupposition there. What do ant colonies have minds? How would we tell? And then, as I said, I'll kind of just start from the assumption that, let's suppose they do. What would their experiences then be like? And I tried to kind of break that down into a list of kind of 6 interesting questions there. And at each point, my aim is not to try and say anything definitive, but just to kind of gesture at where I think available evidence might point us what kinds of broad ideas we might be in a good position to conclude. It is fascinating to discover how disconcerting it can be to give a talk when you can't see any of the audience members. But I trust that you're there. So, as I said, there's this initial question: do ant colonies have minds? In particular, do they have conscious minds? Is there anything that it's like to be an ant colony? And I think the basic answer to this has to be we don't know, and that's for 2 reasons. Right? There are 2 layers of, I think, pretty deep difficulty here. One is that we don't know enough about ants. There's a lot of empirical research, a lot of discoveries, a lot of further information that we'd like to gather about what goes on in an ant colony and how information is flowing there. And we also just don't know enough about minds. And I think it would be inappropriate for anyone to have a very firm position on this question, given the intersection of these two major forms of uncertainty. So just to kind of unpack those a little bit, I think there is presently huge uncertainty in philosophy, in neuroscience, in human society about what a mind is, why they have conscious experiences, what sort of physical processes constitute consciousness in humans, and things like that. Views range all the way from illusionism, which is the idea that there's no such thing as consciousness, no one really has conscious experiences, that's just a kind of illusion that the mind kind of plays on itself, all the way to the position I think is actually most likely to be true, which is panpsychism, that consciousness is in some sense everywhere, kind of just inherent in all parts of the material world. But most people are somewhere in the middle. Most people assume that the matter that makes up my hand is not conscious, but the matter that makes up my brain is, and that something about how the brain matter is organized distinguishes it from other systems of matter. But there is, as I said, huge uncertainty about what sort of organization it is that matters. And that's important because that means we don't even really know what we would be looking at when we're studying ants. We don't quite know what sort of information processing or functional structure an ant colony would need to have in order to be conscious. And we also just don't know a lot about how ants work. We're still making huge discoveries about the psychology of individual ants, individual insects generally. And we also don't know, anywhere near as much as we'd like to about how they communicate, what messages are spread from one ant to another, how they spread within a nest. Even if you knew everything about individual neurons, and even if you understood the mechanisms of a synaptic transmission between two neurons, you'd still be, obviously very far away from understanding how a human brain works, or how it's different from any other brain or any other nerve cluster, without knowing, the overall pattern of information flow. So in some of my other work that I won't really be presenting today, I've tried to make the best case I can that there's a decent chance that ant colonies are conscious, that this is at least something that we shouldn't dismiss or rule out. But I won't be focusing on that today. I think for today, I'm going to focus on this thought that the best we can do really is ask what follows from certain suppositions. If we resolve this uncertainty by just kind of assuming certain answers, how far could we get? So the main part of the talk is section 2. If ant colonies do have minds, then what? As I said, I'm going to make some suppositions. I'm going to suppose, for a start, that consciousness is at least relatively widespread in nature, that it's not a rare, unusual thing that mammals and birds maybe just happen to have kind of chanced into. I won't assume all the way to panpsychism, but I'll assume that whatever consciousness is, it's relatively abundant. And so I take that to make it, at least a plausible hypothesis that an ant colony, as a collective, might well have a mind. At the same time, I will assume also that consciousness depends entirely on physical information processing. It's not something free-floating or independent of the physical world that we study. And this is important because this means that we can get at something about ant colony minds by studying the physical makeup of the ant colony, by studying what signals are being passed from ant to ant and what effects that has. But thirdly, I will be supposing that consciousness is irreducibly subjective. can't be fully understood from the outside. And that means that even if ant colonies are conscious, and even if we study ant colonies for as many centuries as we would like to, we won't be able to fully understand what it's like to be an ant colony just because we're not ant colonies. You know, my title is, I think, a fairly obvious homage to Thomas Nagel's famous paper, What is it like to be a bat? And part of what he really hammers in that paper is, if you're not a bat, you're not going to be able to fully answer this question. Something about the subjective quality of consciousness will make it forever inaccessible, but you might still be able to kind of delimit the broad outlines and structures of a bat consciousness. So I'm going to see, you know, how far can we get on doing the same kind of thing with an ant colony. And I should say also, you know, I will focus on ants because that's, you know, that's what the book is about. And ants are a very successful, very widespread eusocial species. But I think a lot of this will apply also to you know, honeybees and other eusocial bee species, termites, and to those wasp species that also live in large collectives. In fact, at one point I will make special reference to honeybees because in some respects I think they're better understood than ants. Okay, so yeah, that's the setup of the talk is, let us suppose that there is an ant colony mind and we can try to study it by looking at how the ant colony works. So what can we say there? Well, just to get our bearings, I think it could be useful to ask, does an ant colony have a brain? Because I think, you know, people sometimes find the idea of a collective mind puzzling because they think, well, so to have a mind, surely you have to have a brain, right? At least in our own case, that's how it works. But there's no brain, you know, hiding in the ant colony. If you dig in there, you're not going to find a secret, you know, giant brain. It's not like the queen ant is a brain or anything. If anything, the queen ant is really more like an ovary. You know, it's a reproductive organ. So, you know, I think this is true to an extent. To be conscious, I think, requires having some sort of organ of coordination analogous to a brain, at least to be conscious in anything like the way that we're familiar with. But ant colonies don't have to have a separate brain to have an organ of coordination there. There is a physical structure that is responsible for coordinating the movements of the ants that make up the colony. It's just that structure is distributed and decentralized. I think it is roughly equal to the brains of all the ants. So, you know, you have 100,000 ants. Consider their cerebral or cephalic ganglia, the little kind of nerve clusters in the head that will play the role of something like a brain. Consider those as a set, as a whole. There is something else though. You also have to add the information channels by which they communicate, right? Because all the neurons that make up my brain, they wouldn't be a brain at all if you just had them sitting in a pile. They have to be connected. They have to be communicating with each other. Fortunately, the brains of the ants do communicate with each other through a variety of mechanisms, drumming with their antennae, releasing pheromones. Depending on the species, you know, vision may play a larger role. And those information channels, you know, kind of like the synapses between neurons and the brain, those information channels vary. Some of them are very bodily. You know, the body of one ant touches the body of another when it, for instance, drums with its antennae. And so on that occasion, the information channel is a body part, you know, organic tissue. Whereas if the two ants communicate visually, if one of them picks up what the other is doing by seeing it, then the information channel temporarily includes the space, the air between them. And when they lay down pheromone trails, you know, that's a medium of information transfer that persists for a while outside the body of any particular ant. So I'm thinking you take all the brains of all the ants and you add in the information channels by which they communicate. That system, that is the brain of the ant colony. So we can call this the colony's brain. It's not a brain in a strict anatomical sense. It doesn't have a brain stem and a midbrain and a forebrain. But I think it qualifies as a brain in something like the same way that you might think of a robot or an android as having its central processing unit being its brain. Data in Star Trek is referred to as having a positronic brain, although it's obviously not anatomically the same organ as a human brain. But note some key differences from human brains. As I said, it is very decentralized. There isn't, as far as we know, at least as far as I know, a part of this brain where everything comes together, or even where large amounts of stuff come together. The ants largely are all kind of doing their own thing, getting kind of horizontal inputs from each other. There isn't anything like you might think the prefrontal cortex that plays an overall centralized control role. It's also an open air brain. So I mentioned that the information channels often are some big air gap, and that makes it in some ways very vulnerable. I pick things up, and I exert pressure on things using parts of my body other than my brain. If I had to use my brain to pick things up and open doors, I would take brain damage basically all the time. So an open air brain is in some ways kind of a vulnerability, but it's mitigated by one other feature, which is that an ant colony's brain appears to be, we might say, hyperplastic. The human brain can recover from brain damage by kind of rerouting, giving old neurons new jobs, making new connections. But it has a fairly limited ability to do that. By contrast, it seems like ant colonies are set up so that you can have a lot of ants be killed or eaten by a wandering anteater, and still have the others take over enough of the function for the system to keep working. Okay, so that's brains. Here's a slightly broader question. If an ant colony has a mind, does it have a body? And obviously, it doesn't have a separate body in addition to the bodies of the ants. And I think people do sometimes worry about collective minds that well, they're not in any of the individual bodies of the members. So are they going to be somehow disembodied? It almost feels like this mind is going to be free floating, non-physical, almost kind of above it all. I actually think it's likely to be the opposite, at least with ant colonies. I think they are likely to be hyper-embodied, that their minds are. So let me say, how I'm thinking about bodies here. I take it that a body is something like a set of parts with some degree of causal coupling and common origin, right? So the different organs and different tissues of my body form one body, in part because they are causally coupled to one another. If you take hold of one finger and pull it, other parts of my body come with it. Unless you pull it really hard and really fast. And more broadly, there's metabolic coupling. What's going on in this finger is likely to be similar to what's going on in the other parts because the circulatory system is feeding the same nutrients and oxygen into them all. And it also seems relevant that they all grew from the same embryo, same zygote, perhaps. And by that definition, there are going to be some disputed cases where it's not completely clear if something is part of your body. So some people who have prosthetics, prosthetic leg, experience it as being in some respects part of their body, but at the same time it doesn't have a common origin, has an exogenous origin, and it may be relatively easy to remove. Or on the other hand, it may be firmly attached. Whereas if you take something like dandruff, dead skin, dead bits of hair, severed finger, if you pulled on my finger really hard, those might in some sense still be seen as part of my body because they came from it, but they're no longer causally coupled to it. Potentially there's room for controversy about whether a fetus would be part of my body if I was just stating it in my womb. I think it's kind of an open question whether a snail shell or various other shells that animals produce or secrete around themselves are body parts. Or whether a hermit crab has a snail shell as a body part once it's taken it up. Maybe one of the most interesting cases, I'm just going to put a picture here. The entomologists in the audience are probably familiar with caddisfly larvae, which use silk to assemble bits of like stones and twigs from the riverbed into a kind of casing to protect themselves. That seems to be in some respects part of their body, but in other respects not. Okay, so that's what it is. I take it for a set of things to be a body. What is it for them to be my body or the body belonging to a particular mind? Well, I take it that it's primarily about the body that I can directly feel and control, and which contains my brain. That is the organ or system on which my mental life directly depends. So this body here that you guys, I believe, are able to see right now, this is my body because I can make it do things without having to manipulate another body that's connected to it. I can make other bodies do things. I can, pick up a stick and, make another body move somewhere by poking it, but that's not direct control. And likewise, I can feel what happened in this body. I can see through its eyes. I can notice any pain that it suffers. And I can also do that with other bodies, but indirectly. I need the things happening in that body to have some effect on my body. So by these criteria, I would suggest the following for what is an ant colony's body. I think it would be all the ants. Okay, that's a start. But I think also the pheromone trails, right? Given that those arise from the ants laying them down, and they play, a crucial role in the brain functioning, so to speak, of the colony. I think also the eggs and larvae, even though they are not, depending on whether you count them as ants yet, I suppose. Those are maybe something like a fetus, an ovary, a reproductive system that is not yet performing functions in a kind of directed or controlled way. And potentially the nest structure, especially if it's made by the insects themselves, if they kind of regurgitate material the way that, for instance, termites do, or wasps will make nests out of paper, bees will use wax to build a nest, and that I think makes it more like a shell, I'd say. The ants at the top and bottom of my slide here, of course, are leafcutter ants who use the leaves to feed a fungus. You might think maybe the fungus is part of the ant colony's body, kind of analogous to the gut bacteria in my body. They play a digestive role. They're genetically different, but they're so metabolically integrated that they count as part of the body nevertheless. Okay, so that's brains and bodies. Let's get on to minds themselves. What kind of mind might an ant colony have? And here I guess I do want to start with a kind of a big metaphysical question. Would a colony mind be a genuinely new thing, a real mind in its own right? Or would it be just the old ant mind kind of redescribed? And I think this is a dilemma that people often get kind of hung up on when thinking about, for instance, collective mind or collective agency in the human case. Are we really talking about a group being an agent or having a mind itself, which might seem very kind inflationary, like, oh wow, you're adding this new thing to our ontology? Or are we just kind of redescribing what's already there, in which case it seems kind of boring and trivial? And I'm going to suggest this is a false dichotomy. I think a colony mind, if it existed, could be a genuine mind, not just a new way of describing what was already thought to be going on. Genuine conscious individual, and yet it can also be fully constituted by the many ant minds interacting. After all, that is, I take it, what we want to say about the colony as an organism or as a body. It's not an extra thing on top of all the ants and their eggs and their nest. It is just them, but they take on a new status by entering into certain patterns of interaction. The colony's brain is constituted by many interacting brains, so the colony's mind will be constituted by many interacting minds. It is new in that it's only when they start interacting that they form a mind, but it's not something extra on top of them. I have this diagram in my paper in the book, or I think it's maybe a shrunken or simplified version of it, where I'm using the thought bubbles here to represent minds, and the letters to represent various different experiential contents. So each ant is, maybe experiencing some degree of, hunger or alarm or, whatever pheromonal feedback inputs it gets. And so the different ants are experiencing different combinations of things. And the colony mind is going to be a subset of that, at least, some of the experiences of the individual ants, those which perhaps are in particularly close causal dependence on the experiences of other ants. And so the oval that I've drawn there, the blue oval, is the colony mind, and it is distinct from any of the individual ant mind. It's not the same thing. It has different content, in particular, different letters appear in it, but it's not anything over and above them. We didn't need to write any new letters to make it. That's the idea. I will note, this is likely to seem impossible if you think of mind as essentially private and bounded, right? So you might think, look, the privacy of the mental is that no experience in my mind can also be part of another mind, the way that, if you can see my cursor, I'm kind of pointing at the A here in one of the ant thought bubbles on the left side, that is both an experience of the ants and also an element of the colony's experience. You might think that violates the privacy of experience. Likewise, you might think, well, for the colony to have a unified experience, all of the experiences within that oval have to be in some way kind of touching mentally. They have to be kind of connected or phenomenally unified, as people sometimes say. But that requires the experiences of one ant to be phenomenally unified with the experiences of another ant. And the way we normally think about conscious unity is we tend to assume that doesn't happen. My experiences are only ever unified with my own experiences. These are big and interesting questions, which I feel a little bad for kind of skating over here. My excuse is, look, I've argued in other work, I think we actually have very good reason to move away from this way of thinking. Given that the brain, the human brain, like every other physical system, is divisible into parts and can overlap with other physical systems, I think it's actually probably a good idea to at least weaken or qualify the aspects in which we think of consciousness as, or the mind as private and bounded. Defending the possibility of mental combination, in a sense, is sort of my thing. I have a book called Combining Minds. It's kind of trying to engage with these issues about privacy and boundedness in the abstract in general. But today I wanted to talk primarily about ants in particular. And I think I'm should probably speed up if I want to do that. So, okay, what do ant colonies experience? Well, first question, do they perceive things? Perceptual experiences are a very salient category for us. So when we as human beings have perceptual experiences, it looks like that's from three things happening. First, some sensory nerves pick up a stimulus, right? We have to be sensitive to something in the environment. But that's not enough by itself. The information from those nerves has to spread more broadly within the brain. It has to activate other neurons that will activate other neurons, and so on. And finally, this broader activity has to play a certain perception-like functional role. It has to be used to guide the updating of beliefs or the direction of action. Not just any spreading broader activity is enough. If I see a strobe light and it gives me an epileptic seizure, that doesn't qualify as a perceptual experience. So I'm thinking for an ant colony to perceive things, we should look for something analogous. Some ants picking up a stimulus, information from those ants spreading to the other ants, and then this broader activity playing the right kind of functional role, serving like a perception to detect salient things in the environment and guide responses to them. Now, I think we have a fair amount of info at this point about what particular stimuli particular ants can pick up. We know that they're very driven by smell, for instance, but that some of them have decent vision. And we can, I think, often make reasonable guesses about what kind of functional roles are being played, at least at a coarse-grained level, by when these ants found a sweet thing, and then they came back to the colony, and then a whole load more ants went out and got that sweet thing. We can kind of draw some reasonable inferences about the basic functional setup there by thinking about what is in the colony's evolutionary interest. But it's this middle section that is, I think, really hard to study. Exactly how, exactly what kind of pattern of information is being spread. I think this is, I'm not at all an expert, but my sense is this is just hard to study because they're small, and we can't really kind of put little, electrodes inside an ant very easily, and they're often doing it inside a nest where we can't really see what's going on. That's why it is handy to go and look at honeybees, because they communicate information about stimuli in a way that we are, in some respects, much better able to observe. We can see them dancing. And people have done, I think, a pretty good job of kind of decoding the way that bees returning to the hive dance, wiggle themselves and run in various directions to transmit information about both food sources and nest sites, and to recruit other bees to either join the dance or to go to the site and then come back and join the dance. And so if I can kind of use this just as an example to work with, there seem to be limitations in what information is transmitted, right? The bee can't tell the other bees what color a flower was, as far as we know. It can transmit how far away, what direction, and how rich of a food source it is, or how attractive a nest site it is. And I'm thinking, just like, our retina picks up only certain wavelengths of light filtered through certain cones, and that governs the qualities of our visual experience. Likewise, if the colony is perceiving food sources and nest sites, it's probably going to be perceiving them as varying in only these three ways, right? Those are going to be the qualities, so to speak, of its perceptual representations. I also think, we can kind of surmise maybe larger numbers of recruited bees might correspond to more attentive, vivid, or more conscious representations. Whereas if only, one bee is dancing and maybe one other bee goes to that flower and it kind of peters out, that might be more like an unconscious perception, the way that we often kind of shift or adjust our posture or move our eyes without really being conscious of why we're doing so. So, for example, there's generally fairly large recruitment for moving a nest site. The honeybees will often end up in a situation where at a certain point, like half the colony or more is dancing the message for a particular nest site because they want to achieve a kind of consensus because they're all going to move there en masse. And so I kind of like to imagine maybe being a honeybee colony, it's like you're kind of half asleep most of the year, just kind of habitually gathering things up. And then you wake up once in the year to move to a new nest site. And that's a little speculative, but I'd like to imagine that. Okay, what about other kinds of experiences? I know I'm getting towards the end of my time here. It's much harder to say anything very definite here. It seems likely that if colonies are conscious, they might feel something like emotions under the following circumstances. There are shifts in the behavior of multiple ants in the ant colony that are partly produced by interactions between the ants, so they're interdependent. And they're governed by some sort of evolved feedback mechanism that's designed to get larger or smaller or appropriately regulated numbers of ants involved. And so this might include most obviously alarm when attacked. One ant detects a threat and it responds in a way that alerts other ants who also spread the alarm to other ants, and you get this sudden shift of a lot of the ants being recruited to a new behavior. You might think about similar things as happening on a slightly larger time scale, when food stocks are higher or lower and the colony kind of shifts to gathering more food or focusing on other things. And maybe when there's one food source that draws out loads and loads of ants, but it's so attractive, that's kind of like the ant colony's stream of consciousness being kind of drawn to it. So I'm kind of thinking that the more ants are involved in a certain organized pattern, the more that corresponding experience made up of those ants' experiences will predominate. So maybe alarm, defense against invasion, that's a very vivid experience that grabs the colony's attention. But maybe everyday foraging is so distributed, so habitual that it's, I kind of said, half asleep, kind of mostly no need to pay much attention. I also think it's likely that ant colony experiences will blur the boundaries we're used to drawing, like sensory versus motor, affective versus cognitive, bodily versus intellectual. I detect a food source and I reach out and I gather up the food. That would all be like one experience. Whereas for a human being, it's like, oh, I have a separable perception. I am also separately aware that I want that food. I form a decision to reach for it. That causes the experience of reaching. All of those are separable for us because they occur at separate stages in our centralized brain. Whereas the ant colony is kind of hyper-embodied. Its brain is spread all throughout its body. Maybe the best model among different human experiences are bodily senses. The way that my body feels when I'm just kind of vibing. I'm kind of responding to things I feel without much pre-thought going into it. So being an ant colony might in some ways be a bit like having your eyes closed and just sort of sleepily fumbling for things and pulling them to you and seeking to be a little bit more comfortable. Okay. I hope I have time to very briefly comment on the potential ethical implications, which I think are modest. So here's a common idea people often have called sentientism. If something has conscious experiences, or perhaps more specifically, if something can consciously feel pleasure or suffering, then we owe it some degree of moral consideration. We at least ought not to cause it suffering that we can avoid. Perhaps we ought not to needlessly destroy it. Suppose we accepted that. Suppose we accepted sentientism and accepted that individual ants are sentient beings in some very simple ant-like way, and that ant colonies are sentient in the way that I've been kind of exploring. I think it follows that ant colonies would deserve moral consideration as collectives. That we should care about not needlessly destroying or harming the ant colony. But the colony mind, I've been really trying to stress, isn't a separate thing from the ant's mind. It's just them taken collectively in certain dynamic patterns. And so I think, yes, we should give some more weight to, principles like don't needlessly cause ants to suffer, and don't needlessly cause an ant colony to suffer, if it's even capable of suffering. But the moral weight that we give to these two goals might be non-additive, right? Like if they both have, moral weight 1.5, their combined moral weight might not have to be 3. It might be just 1.5, or it might be 2 or something. In the same way that, the physical weight of the ant colony shouldn't be added to the physical weight of the ants, because they're just the same thing, kind of viewed from 2 different perspectives. Okay, wrapping up, I have not tried to establish any definite conclusions here. I haven't even really tried to persuade you that ant colonies are conscious. Maybe they don't. Maybe there is no ant colony mind there at all, and that's just a human projection. I've just tried to suggest some initial outlines of what colony minds might be like if they existed. I think they have decentralized open-air brains, hyper-embodied experiences that may blur the boundaries between perceptual and emotional consciousness. But yeah, thanks again for watching, and thanks to Anderson and all collaborators for putting this all together. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Luke.
Okay.
So we are open to questions. You can just raise your hand here. So let me see. Sophie, please, you can start.
Oh, okay. So you suggest that the colony itself and the minds of the individual ants might have sort of equivalent moral status, and by which I mean, like we might not have to count each individual ants as a moral each of the individual ants as a moral subject, and then the colony is a separate, distinct moral subject that counts for something over and above the moral worth of each of the individual ants. It might be the case that an ant colony as a whole is just 1.5, has a moral value of 1.5, whatever that means, or is 1.5 moral subjects or something. But then I was just thinking, so ordinarily when we're talking about how to treat ants or how to treat ant colonies, we have to make a decision about whether to speak of the individual ants or of the collective mind itself. So if the two are equivalent, I guess, which should be more salient to us in our discussion, do you think? Should we generally, when making moral decisions, make more salient the group of minds that are part of the collective, or the single collective mind as a whole, or does that even matter?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I guess I'm inclined to give like two layers of answer. So the first layer is, if we could determine that considered as a collective, the colony it has the kind of mind that would give it a higher moral status than an individual ant, then we should focus on that. If it seems to have the kind of mind that would give it a lower moral status than an individual ant, we should focus on the individuals. Now, what I find interesting about ant colonies is they almost seem like they're kind of on a par. Like it's not obvious a priori which of those is the case. I think that with humans, for instance, I think I'm definitely a more important being than any of my neurons is individually. But I also think that human collective groups are, because they're really not that integrated, are not going to be moral subjects on the level of a human individual. So I think in the human case, it's clear kind of where the greatest complexity, the greatest autonomy exists in the kind of the level of scales. Whereas with ants, it's not clear, at least to me, where that peak is. So given that, I guess I would kind of go to my second layer response, which is what do we have a better practical handle on? A lot of the time I feel like I kind of have a sense of what would be mean, cruel to an individual ant, was I much less able to tell, I don't know, what would benefit or harm a colony. So that might be some reason to think more in terms of individual ants. I don't know. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with your second point in particular. Like if I'm, I feel like I can relate more to an individual ant than to an individual ant colony, and so I have a better sense of how to treat an individual ants. Or I feel like I have a better sense of how to treat, each individual ant separately than I do as to how to treat the colony as a whole. I mean, even though ants and I are very different, we share certain body parts in general. Some of the same kinds of noxious stimuli that will harm me will also harm the ant. So if I don't want to hurt an ant, I should avoid that kind of stimuli. Whereas with ant colonies, I mean, I basically agree with you that we just kind of have no idea at the moment. We're given how little we know about consciousness in general and how little we know about ants. So I think that's basically right. I'm also inclined to think that maybe there's reason to believe that the ant colony mind as a whole, if there is one, is less important because of its almost replaceability. I'm not quite sure how to describe this intuition, and I don't have a sort of well worked out thought on this. But so like, let's say you have let's say you have an ant colony, and then you come and somebody comes and smashes the ant colony and drags the dust that they built for the nest all over the place and kills maybe 75% of the ants. The remaining 25% of the ants, in my limited understanding of ant behavior, if you know more about ant behavior than me and this is wrong, please correct me. But my understanding is that, then the remaining 25% can sort of recover. They can come back and they can rebuild their colony over time and eventually construct and be just as great as they once were and have a new queen and have new babies and whatever. Whereas if you kill an individual ant, that's the end of the individual ant. The ants can't come back to life. So there's a sense in which doing something, I'm again, sorry, this isn't well worked out, but I think there's a sense in which maybe ant colonies are impervious to damage because of the extent to which their parts are replaceable.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, of course, some individual organisms can regrow, body parts to more than we can. But you might think a colony is more able to do that.
Yeah.
But I guess it seems to me like this isn't completely asymmetrical. I can imagine a situation where, like, if the ants are dispersed, you might think, well, the colony is dead, even if lots of the individual ants are still out there, either starting new colonies or joining other colonies, or just, I mean, it depends on exactly the mechanism of like queen selection. But in general, like, I think a collective can survive when many or even all of its members die, as long as the deaths are kind of staggered. But also it's possible for individual members to survive even when a collective is destroyed. So it does seem like, yeah, there are different, like if they have an interest in avoiding destruction, then what counts as destruction will be different. But it's not clear that there's a strict asymmetry in like what they can survive, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that seems right to me.
I'm going to translate the question João Carlos wrote here in the chat.
Yes.
Okay? So he wrote something like, I understood the part about the body, consciousness, and mind, what they are, but at times mind and consciousness are used interchangeably, I believe due to cultural characteristics and common usage in the Portuguese language. And I think he's referring to the words body, consciousness, and mind, mainly mind and consciousness. So I would like to ask Luke to distinguish between mind and consciousness. What this distinction will be in English, maybe. I understood that he sees consciousness as merely the processing of physical information, but I didn't understand the distinction between mind and consciousness and his notion of body and brain, if there is a distinction. Yeah, that's the question.
Well, yes, no, these are very, these are not super clear or even well understood, I think, even in English. So mind, I think, would be at the broader category and would potentially include unconscious processes. But people debate what exactly is kind of the boundary of the mind, but it seems like it would include, for instance, memory and perception, even when I'm not conscious of those going on. So, I have a lot of memories, a lot of information kind of stored in my mind that I can access, but it's only when I do access it that it enters my consciousness. Consciousness is something like what it's like to be me right now, or what experiences I'm having. Oh, you can turn on your microphone. Or can we hear you?
Now I can hear and I can speak.
Yes. Okay. So did I answer your question just now?
Yeah, so the mind includes subject aspects and the conscience no.
The consciousness is specifically the subjective aspects, and the mind is everything broader than that.
I understand. That's clear. Thanks.
So now we have João Felipe. Now you have a voice, right? João Felipe?
Yeah, I guess that I can speak now. Do you listen well?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you.
So my interest is about pump psychism, is my actual research. Yeah. So I was wondering if you think that if the combination minds will possible in ant colonies, for example, if through this kind of systems we could learn more how we could find the right criterions for combination in the case of our own minds, I don't know if I was clear, my English not so good.
No, perfectly clear. Yeah. So for other people in the audience, so people often criticize panpsychism and say, well, even if you think consciousness, some very simple kind of subjective feeling is there everywhere, what explains why it combines into an organized mind sometimes and not other times? Why it combines in the human brain and not other places? So I have a lot of thoughts on this. I guess maybe I want to start by saying I think combining versus not combining is too much of a dichotomy. I think there's a continuum between very integrated and complex forms of combination where, in my brain, I can differentiate lots of different things that are going on, and I can also put them all together. And the kind of combination that's just everything is kind of thrown in and it blurs together. And I think an ant colony mind might actually be really useful here because it might be sort of halfway between, right? Like there's all of these component minds and they're kind of connected enough that there might be some patterns like kind of waves on the sea, but not the kind of clear, detailed images that I can form in my human mind. Particularly because among different insects, you'll see different degrees of, eusocial organization. Ants and honeybees and termites are kind of the extreme. But if you look at different wasp and different other bee species, there's all sorts of different degrees of how much they live together and how much they communicate and work together. So yeah, I guess my basic answer is yes. And they kind of show us intermediate stages on a continuum. Does that make sense?
Yes, totally. I would like to thank you, Luke. It's very, very clear to me. Thank you.
Okay, good. I do apologize if I'm speaking fast. I have to tell myself to slow down and
Luke,
announce.
you speaking Very, very nice. Just not rapidly. Sound is like
Quietly?
yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Just
My partner tells me that at home. Like, you have to speak up. I can't hear you from the other room.
that.
Some people's
Alright.
families, they yell.
Yeah, but you, Luke and Sophie, don't be embarrassed or anything. It's just, I mean, they have to try to understand. You're native, so it's hard for them. So let's
very hard
go easy. Let's
for
try
me.
to go easy, right?
Yeah, in the Portuguese sessions, I would be.
Yeah, I mean, these people speak Portuguese pretty fast. They know that. Let's go to, there is one more question by Fernando, and I would like to add a question of my own at the end. So let's wrap up this section with Fernando, please. Can you speak, Fernando? Where is Paulo? Is he enabled to speak here? Oh, yes, there you are. Yeah, I mean, at least I can see him. Can you unlock your micro, Fernando?
Yeah, okay, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation and for the event. Luke, I really appreciated a lot what your talk. I'm a psycholinguist by training, and especially my career was based on connectionist models and language processing and neural networks, and your ideas is really in line with the work of the first ones from, for instance, the PDP research group, David Rinnerhart and James McClelland, on parallel distributed processing, and this idea of brain as a set of connections working in concert, and the very idea of consciousness as a byproduct of very tiny elements. I mean, you have brains at work, and then you have synapses, and then you have consciousness as a byproduct of the working of brains like this, neurons firing together, and this emergentist idea. So I think it's really ingenious, your idea of ant colonies as a metaphor for brain, and the final product, as something. I know it may sound odd to some, but these very working of the brain, and the idea of consciousness as a byproduct of this of the brain working like this is really fascinating. Totally grounded on matter. Okay, thank you very much. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can just add one quick note on that.
No, of course, yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't say byproduct personally. I think a byproduct is suggesting a separate thing that doesn't do anything, like an epiphenomenon. I think I prefer to think of consciousness as the very process itself, but what it's like from the inside. So this is kind of a double aspect view, where it's the neural network itself that is the consciousness. It's just that what it looks like from an outside perspective is a neural network, and consciousness is what it's like from the inside. And that, I think, does better at capturing the idea that consciousness can have causal effect. It can make a difference to what happens. although I suspect for many purposes that distinction may not matter hugely. So I do appreciate your question.
I'm going to let Anderson go first, and then I make my question at the end. Anderson, please.
Hi, Luke. I think your argument is brilliant. The five questions that you suggest work well as analytical criterion for colonies, such as siphonophores. And with respect to the Pushmai-Puliu representation, do you think it applies to fungal networks, given their motor-like responses to environmental sensory stimuli? I think what you proposed in the article is a set of very interesting ideas for examining collective consciousness in invertebrate colonies. And this is something I am very interested in. Thank you.
Yeah, so you asked there about other organisms like fungal networks or siphonophores. Yeah, they are also fascinating. I don't know offhand how I would want to think about them. I definitely, yeah, I would want to apply the same kinds of questions. I think part of why I am maybe wary of attributing representations to, for instance, fungal networks or to processes going on in plants is that I think the functional role of a representation, whether it's a pushing representation, kind of making you go out and do something, or a perception, a representation of what's coming in, is that I feel like I want to see those having kind of being combinable with a variety of other functional states. So a representation of a perception that can be factored in to guide many different responses. Whereas my sense is that a lot of fungi and plants have interesting responses, but it's like one response to one stimulus. And it doesn't seem like there's that kind of, this stimulus is being registered and then that can be used to determine a number of different responses based on other stimuli. So it's that kind of integration of multiple streams of information that I think I would look for before attributing representations to a fungus. But I don't know too much about fungi, so we may well find that. That would be really interesting.
All right. So
Okay.
I have a question of my own. It's just two comments. The first thing is about this the idea of a colony body. And the second thing about this, the colony's brain. So let's talk about the body first. The body, you said that, I mean, of course, it's a somehow vague notion, and you included all the ants, pheromone trails, eggs, and nest structure. So the nest structure struck me as particularly uncommon because that's what we would consider to be the niche, right? The niche construction or something like that. Mm-hmm. So of course the ants, they construct the niche around them in a certain way, and the nest and even the trails, the pheromone trails, they seem to be part of this niche construction. So I just wonder why include it in the body instead of in the niche, and in a certain way. Maybe you have to bite this bullet that what you are attributing consciousness to is not only a body, but a niche. And the second question is about the colony's brain. And of course, I mean, it's hard. You just assumed in your talk that the colony or ants are consciousness and to a certain degree, and the question is just what it's like to be, right, a colony. But my question has to do with all the criteria we use to attribute consciousness to brains. They, of course, you have integrated information theory that's very general, so they pretty much like see consciousness everywhere. But if you think of a certain architecture or organization of information, it seems to be just a tiny part of the brain. And most of the theories in science of consciousness, they think of this process as being, even like if you take most of the information being processed in the brain, most of it is unconscious. So you have this interesting architecture that's actually linked to conscious processes. So why, even if there is a colony's brain, why believe that this brain is conscious at all and not just kind of, even if there is highly sophisticated integration of information? So those are the two questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Good. Okay, I'll try to answer briefly, even if maybe unsatisfyingly, to let Daniel take over. Yeah, so the nest you might think of as more like the niche. I mean, I guess I was thinking, if they build a nest out of regurgitated mud or paper or wax, that feels pretty close to like a snail's shell that is, secreted from the body. And then it might seem strange to have like very radically different ideas about what the body includes in those species versus in species that just dig. But I'm not wedded, I guess, to a view that I was just trying to kind of open up the possibility. Why I think that it is conscious at all? I mean, I guess I'm basically coming from a perspective that's closer to integrated information theory and seeing consciousness pretty widely. I'm kind of inclined to think that a lot of what's happening in the brain, on some level, might be conscious, but just kind of overlaid by a stronger layer that's the global workspace, say. And I do talk a little in the paper about the difficulty of applying global workspace models outside the human brain, because you have to figure out, what counts as global enough. But yeah, the global workspace might well be one of the views on which you end up saying an ant colony doesn't have a mind. So as you say, it's going to be hostage to choice of theory.
Right. Okay, well, thank you very much, Luke. And well, I think we should, because of time, move on to the next talk. So Daniel, are you ready? Okay, let me, did I introduce Maria Luiza when I introduced you too?
I'll introduce her in my slide.
All right, so I'm gonna let it to you. So please, you can start.
Thank you. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Luke. That was very comprehensive. Those are definitely many of the key and open questions, from what is it like to the ethical implications. So, and also I'd like to appreciate the editors who put together this book, which is really a great collective outcome. So I'm going to be presenting, and I will write in the chat. You can write any questions in the chat, and I'll try to address it if it's the right moment. And this is going to be discussing the paper that I wrote with Maria Luiza Iennaco, who's a PhD student at USP in Brazil, in Porto. And she's a philosopher with interest in a lot of shared topics and attention and cognitive science and predictive processing. And so it's been great to work with her for a few years. So today, as our topic benefits from, there may be more questions and future directions than answers, but I also just wanted to share, this was the field work that I did for 5 years. This is in southeastern Arizona in the US. And these are the colonies of the red harvester ant. And that's what they look like, especially when they get little paint on them, which was some of the experiments that I did. So it was during that 2014 to 2019 period where I was reading a lot of the papers and the philosophy and thinking a lot about that, and many of the questions that were just brought up. What about the bodies of the different nestmates? What about the trail? What about the nest? What about the niche? What boundary? How would that be articulated? So that's kind of what we're going to explore. Okay, here's the outline of the paper that Maria and I wrote, which is going to roughly relate to this presentation, but with some fun and different pieces and pictures. First, we talked about different systems of interest, measurements that could be taken, and theories that would be applied to those measurements, and talked about how do we study consciousness, or at least model it, in light of the organism and the environment having this co-determination. And that's where we talk about active inference and the role of unifying approaches to physical and cognitive systems, and then connect it to pluralism and the study of social complexity, which is more empirically grounded, but I think that will be one of the interesting takeaways, is that there's a lot of harmony, if not even overlap or isomorphism, between the study of social complexity and consciousness. And I will add this early note, which is, of course, what is an ant? And here's a drawing I made with an allusion to the Magritte "This is not a pipe" drawing, because an ant refers to the evolutionary phenomena, and it is up for debate or ambiguity whether an ant is the six-legged worker, nestmate, or whether the ant is the colony. And I trace this to a pair of both very influential, although contradictory in their linguistics, papers or books, which is, here's Wheeler, 1911, The Ant Colony as an Organism. And this follows in the spirit of kind of the Kantian organism concept, which is the unit for which the actions are an end unto themselves. And it also follows from the Darwinian organism concept, which is like, we don't say that the liver is a separate organism. We'd say it's part of the human organism, because the liver is part of the reproductive stoma, germline totality of the human. So Wheeler writes the ant colony as organism, which makes the nestmate a tissue. Holdobler and Wilson introduced the superorganism. They kind of add a little spice, little salt on top of that, which implies essentially directly that the nestmate is the organism. So it's actually that slipping of layers that I think causes a lot of ambiguity, when the question is ultimately whether we're talking a more physiological, functional level, or here in this more philosophical space, what is an individual? And so why would a brain have experiences that a region doesn't? Why would a region have it that a neuron doesn't? It's like, that is basically the question, is individuality, and like Luke mentioned, sort of privateness and sharing and compositionality, and what creates a unified, bound awareness experience. So I just talk about nestmates when I'm talking about the six-legged part, or colony when talking about the ensemble. All right. So the paper was Towards the Science of Consciousness and Social Complexity for Ants, which maybe some have seen. It's a famous scene from the movie Zoolander, where this fellow is presented with a mock-up of a educational institution, and he dismissively says, "What is this, a center for ants?" So it's like funny, and broadly people found that funny, at least the scriptwriters did. But when revisiting it, it's like, maybe it's actually a map territory commentary. Like, the model isn't the thing, but then that's the joke, is that he is interpreting it as if that was the thing. So, you know, we're talking about the moon, but we're pointing. So the finger isn't the moon. And that is, especially in the consciousness studies area, one of the most perplexing aspects, and the ineffability of it and how models relate to this territory. So here's some of the key ideas for what we set out to combine in our article. We set some context in terms of scientific pluralism, which the work of Helen Longino and others, I think, does a great job of positioning how disciplinary pluralism doesn't entail a sort of pure relativism, but rather it's like different perspectives that can be taken by different disciplines to study an integrated phenomena. Specifically regarding target system, of course, we're talking mainly about the ants here, empirical measurements, and utilized theory. And then we take an active inference approach to juxtapose consciousness studies, specifically the framework of Birch et al. 2020, and juxtapose that with social complexity studies also in the Hymenoptera. So in terms of the problem statement as we see it, in pursuit of expanding this human-centered approach to consciousness studies, in other words, moving beyond just a anthropocentric or human-only approach to acknowledging our position as human investigators and also wondering what else could have experience without falling into the trap of a view from nowhere, because after all, as long as we're human, the perspectives that we take will always be human. We see the challenge is to find an approach to measure and model conscious systems in a bottom-up fashion, describing and predicting heterogeneity among systems, as they actually are, using a common principle to enable comparability. And that's why ultimately we centered active inference, not because the answers are to be found in a generic framework. It's the opposite. The generic framework is going to give us the kind of grip that lets us have comparability across disparate systems for secondary hypotheses to be made. So it's not going to be like active inference is going to sweep in and deliver an answer. It's the opposite. We're going to create a playing field or a theoretical apparatus where we can compare different systems or different times within even the same system, like sleep and wake. Okay, little background. This is a throwback, blast from the past, and also sort of where some of my conversations with Anderson began, which is a paper that was written in 2018, but then it was published in 2019, bizarrely with a citation date of 2021, with Eric Sovic. And in this paper, in Synthes, we brought up this ant colony test. And this was in response to us having many of the discussions that are brought up today and brought up in the book regarding sort of the pre-paradigmatic situation of consciousness studies, especially in insects or outside of humans. And so we sought to clarify two kinds of tests, forward test and a reverse test. So a forward test is the normal operating mode of science. This is kind of within a paradigm that's established. Like we have a scale at the store. We know it works. We put some food on it. Okay, 3 pounds. Okay, 2 pounds, 2 pounds. So that's when we know that the test works. We believe what it outputs, and then we just put different things on the scale. So if we had a definition for how to measure or test for consciousness, like, oh, you know, it stains purple when you add potassium hydroxide or something funny like that, all we'd have to do is just apply that test all over the world, and we'd be getting back all these answers. But obviously, we're not in that situation because people don't even agree on what the definition of consciousness is. So that's a step that would be required before even the measurement question. So we say, okay, so we don't have the forward test. What could we do with the reverse test? So the reverse test is kind of the mode of test calibration from gold standards or from standards. And this is when paradigms change, is when somebody says, okay, we have a bunch of scales in our store. We don't know which scale is going to work, but we do know that we have a 1, 3, and a 5 pound weight. And so for consciousness, that'd be like sort of, okay, we want to have a framework that is going to reflect that there's this type of consciousness outcome. Now, consciousness specifically is sort of challenged again by not having even that kind of 1 pound, 3 pound, 5 pound weight exactly. But this was just, and that was sort of our point was, okay, well, if we at least have the Cartesian empiricism that we want humans to be conscious, well, then we can kind of back propagate that. But then if we put the ant colony on the scale, what we can do right now at least is say, okay, if we put the ant colony on the scale, what would these different frameworks say about whether it's conscious or not? So there's going to be some that would come back with a yes, like information propagation, and there might be some that come back with no, like the ability to use language to self-report. So that was sort of the background, and then for about 5 or so years, I sort of checked out of the discussion. What Maria and I focused on was just trying to take an empirical bottom-up approach to methodically look at what are we really looking at, what are we measuring, what kinds of theoretical lenses are we applying, and then how does that relate to the kinds of conclusions that we would derive about nestmates and colonies. Like any framework that explicitly deals with neural activation, which Luke alluded to earlier, it will find neural activation patterns at the nestmate level. And Barron and Klein have done a lot of work at the honeybee nestmate level, finding information integration, neural activation, arousal patterns, spatial awareness, all the things that brains do for insects, you will find at the nestmate level. At the colony level, as Luke brought up, there's not a secondary additional brain tissue. So a framework that is going to only center neural activation in a material, literal sense, it's an easy answer. It's not going to support awareness at the colony level. But going back even to Gödel, Escher, Bach, this is kind of the triple play, is the consideration of the ant colony, computers, and humans. At least those are sort of 3 of the systems that we keep in mind and that help us triangulate. And again, there's this ambiguity of what systems are conscious, because somebody will say it's self-report. Oh, but when the LLM tells me that it's having an experience, I don't believe it because of this. So that's kind of the shell game, is people moving around their thresholds. And so that's a lot of the interesting, almost meta-scientific discourse, and also ethical discourse, because it's like some people might implicitly or explicitly take a consequentialist approach to this question, which is like, well, if a large language model is conscious, then we shouldn't turn them off. Or if the ant colony is conscious, then maybe we have to rethink how we do pest management or ecological conservation. So that sounds like a headache. Maybe it's easier if we just socially normalize that insects are not conscious. Like, I always think about how vertebrates, to do experiments on them, require a lot of institutional approval, but it's much less for invertebrates. I mean, maybe that's a justified perspective, but might not be a justified perspective. Or there's little vertebrates and there's large invertebrates, and they differ in memory. And so for these different systems, we can measure different things about them. We can measure physical movement, we can measure the niche modifications or stigmergy, neural activation, electromagnetic fields, linguistic outputs. And then those measurements get projected through different theoretical lenses, which range from the sort of philosophical and metaphysical on through the mathematical. And looking at active inference specifically, which is a unifying approach to modeling different cognitive systems, there's been a flurry of recent work And people have highlighted different aspects of cognitive systems in terms of, from a mechanistic or a functional perspective, what aspects of the system are granting it different kinds of awareness. So in Sandved-Smith, they take a metacognitive perspective, which is like at a primary level, you could have sensory perception. And then at a secondary level, you have attention to perception. But then awareness would be at the tertiary level of acknowledgements of attention or awareness of attention. So that's a metacognitive model. Chris Fields et al. Focused on these nested Markov blankets and supposed that the innermost sort of final Markov blanket partitions the awareness from what is unaware. Robert Warden focused on spatial awareness and focused on that sort of basal cognitive awareness, which is very evolutionary ancient and relates to some cognitive features that mammals and insects have as well. And then I always think back to a question in a written interview that I asked Carl Friston in 2018, where I asked him about, does an ant colony have consciousness? And he said perhaps like an ant colony, which does not. And here he said, we have made this distinction in terms of which systems have awareness, not just which systems appear to have intelligent behavior, sentient behavior, but which ones have awareness. The basis of the counterfactual breadth and temporal depth of generative models. So planning, including the counterfactuality of what if I did otherwise. And planning itself is counterfactual entirely because it's the speculation or the entertainment of things that have not happened. Action plans are not factual, they're counterfactual, though they're cognitively actual. Carl said they must have predictions about the consequences of their actions. So that's interesting because you could even ask whether brains calculate the consequences of action, even in a really restricted setting like chess. The chess player might just have an awareness. Okay, I think in general, this is a good structure, but they might not go down to the very detailed level of the consequences of their actions. So these are just different ways within a unified cognitive approach that people have asked, well, which features would it be that would grant awareness? Now, here I'm going to switch to some work by my postdoctoral advisors, Linksvayer and Johnson, who wrote this paper in 2019, Rethinking the Social Ladder Approach for Elucidating the Evolution and Molecular Basis of Insect Societies. So this paper was their criticism to a very prevalent linguistic, but it diffuses into the theory itself of talking about like higher and lower or more and less social. Even the termites are split into like higher and lower termites. Or there will be social insects, and then there's subsocial. And then there's eusocial, right? The truly social. So there's this idea of like a gradation or a hierarchy by which different societies could be said to be more or less social. And so here's on the right side how they frame that theory, which is we have these different measures of social complexity. One could be colony size. One could be the degree of differentiation amongst nestmates. And so people might say, okay, I mean, a bigger colony is more complex and more differentiation is more complex. And those are just two measures of social complexity. There's many that people might bring up. And so the social ladder hypothesis, which is what they are availing against, would be the sort of simple situation in which all measures of social complexity are positively correlated with each other. Like species that have more nestmates in their colony have more differentiation, and they have more planning, and they have bigger nest architectures, and everything just kind of lines up such that we can just say that there are species that are more socially complex or more social and less. But when you actually project real phenotypes of species onto those measures, That's not what you find at all. So for example, reproductive plasticity and colony size, if you project the phylogeny of the ants and the bees, you find that there's movement all over that phase space. Now, certainly there are patterns in that phase space which ought to be pulled out empirically, but big picture, the idea of there just being more or less social complexity doesn't really make sense at that level. But if you were to operationalize it, like, are there species with larger or smaller colonies? Obviously. Are there species with more or less reproductive plasticity amongst nestmates? Obviously. But that doesn't necessarily grant more or less social complexity or more or less social. However, that is a kind of language and thinking that is quite pervasive. And it also relates to consciousness. And in consciousness, especially the sort of human anesthesiologists do talk about consciousness as arousal. Like, if somebody is on the operating table, it may make sense to talk about more or less conscious, more or less aware. But then if we're thinking about altered states of consciousness, or more broadly, even outside of human, or even just comparing two human experiences, it may not be as simple as just like turning up or down a dial. So what we wanted to do with this table 1 was have social complexity, which is just empirically driven, and consciousness on the left side, and then think, okay, how can we take active inference as a unifying approach to talk about all the kinds of phenotypes that we might empirically measure in the social complexity studies, and then what would we align up with consciousness on the left side. So in social complexity, people are interested in phenotypic aspects of insect colonies. It's kind of funny, like when I think about an entomology space or seminar in contrast with here, they might talk about the exact same questions, like what are the dynamics of trail formation, or how are their nest architectures built, or how many nestmates share what kind of information. It's the exact same questions that are being discussed here, but without the consciousness part. And so it's kind of like the P zombie idea, that you could have some zombie that responds and, you know, kind of like an LLM and says that it's conscious, but it isn't. And so it's sort of like, it's just very interesting. And that is kind of where we take it with this table, just by talking about, well, you know, people talk about the temporal depth of the colony in terms of its social complexity. Like, if it's able to plan for longer, that's kind of the Proverbs 6:6 Bible quote, even about the ant colony planning through the seasons. But then that temporal breadth comes to take on a consciousness overtone in philosophy. Or, for example, the information transfer and synchronization amongst nestmates is studied in terms of communication and functionality in a lot of work, but integrated information interprets it in terms of awareness. And then on the right side, I'm just kind of highlighting the main takeaways that we discussed. So first, these different descriptors for complex adaptive systems apply to two systems of different scales, which is good because we may want to talk about cells, tissues, organisms, societies. We might want to look at multiple scales. So it's good that social complexity studies and consciousness studies have a broad scope. However, we should recognize that the territories they're describing are largely overlapping. So a lot of times, whether we see a given phenomena as just reflecting social or physiological complexity, or whether we're going to interpret that as something that also has a philosophical implication, is going to be heavily theory dependent. The second point is building from that social ladder slide, that when we want to look at social complexity or consciousness, unless we do a lot of constraining we're not going to get a single number or value that gives us a higher or lower or more or less. The third takeaway, also from the sort of social complexity, is that different proposed measures or different aspects of cognitive systems or consciousness, they may not correlate. So we know that even just within the human experience. So at the very least, we want to be able to describe very broadly if we want to open up to beyond that. And then this is sort of, I wouldn't say it's the ultimate skeptical take, because I hope and I would be very excited to see how we can move beyond this. But mere and even total empirical measurement may not resolve philosophical debates. For example, Luke mentioned earlier about recording from insect brains. So that has been done in a few species, in fruit flies mostly, and then to a lesser extent to honeybees. And that's kind of like the research race. The fruit flies are way out in front with the most studies. And then there's the second tier with honeybees and the mosquitoes and a few other species that are well studied. And then there's this very long tail of species that might only have a single study or have never been studied. They've just been found in one location. And that's the pattern that I found when I do gene expression analysis across all of insects. Fruit flies have the most. Then there's the second level of species that have a couple studies, and then it tails off thousands of species with zero. So then I think, okay, what is the state of the philosophical debate in the fruit flies? What if we had 1,000,000 times more research and we were able to have every ant species was genetically as well characterized, or from a neurophysiological perspective, what if every species was characterized as well as a fruit fly? Or then I think, what if we knew where every molecule was in the fruit fly? And then every insect we knew that much. I still think we would have this debate. So kind of looking ahead, let's just say we have some incredible automated laboratories that help us measure the nest mate and the colony level properties and get total molecular level resolution. We know every single gene expression, every electromagnetic field on the colony. I think we would be right there with the sort of Daniel Dennett question. One person's going to look at the colony and say, well, this information integration or this synchrony or this temporal depth, this means that they will, that this kind of experience is happening. Look at how when I poke here or when I put food here, look at how this response happens. I trained them to do this and look at how they do that. And someone else is going to look at that same full data set and just say, I don't think so. So that, again, I don't think it's fatally skeptical, but I think it helps us ground, like, just getting a few measurements from ants are not going to resolve this question, because we can already look to the status of an insect species like the fruit fly, where we have literally thousands of times the amount of published research, and it's not like it's clearer for having that research. So I think that actually makes the work of the philosophers more important, because if it was the case that, oh, well, we just need to do a few gene expression studies and then we're going to have the answer, right? If we had that forward test, then this would be an empirical question that we could just go around the world, collect ants, take some pictures, take some samples, and then it would be a resolved question, like how many base pairs of DNA are in their genome, or what is the volume of this brain region in this species? Those are just empirical questions. The whole point, and again, what really makes the philosophy an important and alive discussion, is that it is not an empirical question. So this is my last slide, and then I'll look to any questions in the chat. This is sort of our conclusion here. So While it is clear there's no linear hierarchy or scala natura for insect sociality, the notion of a scala conscientia, a singular ascending scale of consciousness in which more and less consciousness could exist within or across species, remains implicitly or explicitly entrenched. People talk about situations that would have more or less awareness as if there was some meter stick. The philosophical and conceptual analysis provided here supports an open and rigorous perspective, which we believe will be of great epistemic relevance and pragmatic utility for the field of consciousness studies. And here are sort of our open questions and some of the directions that we are excited to explore going forward. How do we make comparisons amongst different complex systems in terms of different criteria for consciousness and cognition? Are we looking for the same phenomena across different systems that have different embodiments? Because if we do have comparability across different embodiments, it means that what we're comparing is already an abstraction. So that kind of puts us right back in that Zoolander position. If we're going to be studying something abstract like rhythmicity or information integration capacity, something that's not simply a material fact of the world, but some summary statistic, then we kind of lost the plot with a material or an embodied account of consciousness, unless we can re-enter that measurement back into the system, at which point it would be part of that of the system itself. How can existing models of consciousness be adapted or integrated within broader multidimensional models? So, like, if we were just talking about visual awareness, and we could talk about acuity and brightness, color, and field of view. So then if we had one organism with a broad field of view that was low acuity and one with a smaller field of view and high acuity, how would we talk about that? What kinds of analyses would we do in that multidimensional space? How do measures of consciousness in ant colonies relate to measures of social complexity? So when we really get down to the details of, like, okay, we have a fully funded research program for ant colony consciousness because this new book came out and it really raised some critical questions. What measurements are we going to make? And I think, again, as an empirical entomologist, that's kind of the fun question, because a lot of the things that people are talking about in terms of what phenomena would have philosophical implications for ants, that's exactly what people are studying in entomology, but without the implication of awareness per se. How can recent advances in multi-scale systems modeling help us create models of consciousness in diverse cognitive systems? So when we see an aquatic creature or an insect, a solitary insect, which still may need partners or sociality to survive, all the way up on through what the ants and the termites have, which is obligate eusociality. How do we, if we were to show up to a new system, what kind of bottom-up ways would we have of understanding basically the cognitive features of that system? And then what kinds of jumps would take us from different cognitive features to different philosophical implications on up through where Luke ended, which is the moral patienthood, which is, if we have, it's the trolley car problem. There's two ant colonies, one on each branch, and one of them has a bigger colony size, but then the other one has a more correlation with the diurnal cycles. Is that going to matter? Or one of them is older, or one of them has more differentiation amongst the nestmates in gene expression? Those, are real questions. And we could choose to not care, but they're exactly analogous to the kinds of ethical questions that exist for human decision making. And then this is sort of the more deeper theory question, which is, what is the role of the action perception interface and the physics of information processing in consciousness? And how do different types of phenotypic measures help us understand this, especially if we think about reductionism and holism? So we think, okay, well, what is the cognitive interface of the colony? And someone goes, oh, well, that's easy. There's no extra interface. It's just the interfaces of the nestmates. Okay, but then the reductionist is going to take you all the way down. Oh, well, but then the nestmate doesn't really have an interface. It's just the tissues. And the tissue doesn't have an interface. It's just the cells. So if we take this sort of reductionist explaining cognitive systems away, we're going to end up with either the sort of nihilist or something in that neighborhood of just saying, well, surely this level of molecular organization doesn't have awareness, so problem solved, right? Then you can just kill the colony. Or a panpsychist type, well, actually the hydrogen does have awareness because of these other reasons. So how do we take a sort of empirical, grounded, incrementally progressive approach where we're starting with what kinds of measurements would we integrate into what theoretical framework? What are we actually looking to discover and describe? And when we have so much question around even what we would measure or describe from humans, what are going to be some opportunities and challenges when we expand beyond that? And I think the ant colony, again, is this great system for it, because there's something about the colony that has, whether it's sort of social, even calling the colony social is implicitly playing into the Holdobler and Wilson side of the debate. Because if the colony is social, they're eusocial, it's in the name, right? That means that the unit is the nestmate. But if you think that the colony is the organism, then ant colonies are not social, because colonies are not hanging out and talking to each other and sharing resources by definition. So it gets very relevant to study the ants, because it forces us to be precise about what are the levels of physiological and evolutionary unity. How could that relate to a or multiple levels of cognitive or psychological unity? And then how would different levels of physiological coherence and psychological coherence align? Like, would the evolutionary unit of analysis be the functional one and the psychological one? Or could we identify situations where there's a replicator that isn't the physiological unit, and the physiological unit is the cognitive or the psychological unit? And then how would we test that? What if somebody thought that was an important thing to test? Again, what measurements would we make? How would we theoretically analyze them? And what can we do, or what would be different about ants than fruit fly individuals and groups, where we have orders of magnitude more research, but I wouldn't say it's any philosophically clearer. So that is all I've prepared. I'll look to some questions. I hope this has been a helpful addition to the other sections and chapters of the book. Okay, I'm going to read the question. Oh, yeah. Sophie, ask a question, and then I'll read from João Carlos.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daniel. So we have this question by Sophia, and then João Carlos. He wrote down if you want to ask the question.
I'll read João's question. So, your observation that empirical measures are insufficient to answer philosophical questions or doubts, would this point to an inadequacy or limit of language in communicating about this, or to the need for a new epistemology to answer these philosophical questions in an area of knowledge? Yeah, that's, I think, a great question. I'm reminded of the sort of Wittgenstein quotes about the limits of language. And that idea, like, even if we could, and kind of where that connects to the Nagel, what is it like to be a bat, which is like, even if you could, you wouldn't. Even if you could communicate, what would we know? Like, if we could have a neural link or direct connection with the mycelial network or with the ant colony or the tree or even another person, what would be the epistemic status of that communication? I think you are right to point to the limits of language. To me, that's, again, the finger in the moon and the map territory. Like, are we just recombining different propositional definitions and doing a sort of introspective language game? Or are we in an open-ended scenario that is suggesting experiments that are going to uniquely identify predictions or explanations? Because we can recombine definitions of words and be arbitrarily satisfied with that. But if it doesn't result in a unique prediction or experiment, which kind of comes together with empirical work, then there's potentially an infinite number of satisfying poems about ants. And from a cultural perspective, I love that. And from a discourse perspective, I think that's excellent as well. But if it's going to be a science of ant consciousness rather than just a permanent mystery, then I think that is the question, is what could go beyond that? Or what are the blind spots in our epistemology? How do we think about science and philosophy? And are there ways to set up the relationship between science and philosophy where this is unanswerable? Are there ways to set it up in which it is answerable? And then that pushes it back to that layer, which is, do we want to have a philosophy of science that would give us definite answers to these questions, or opens up the space for there to be definite answers? Or are we just looking down that road and thinking, no, we're comfortable with our philosophy of science as it is? So that's why there's so much richness in the ant colony and in this discussion, which, again, I don't see people talking about caterpillar consciousness or butterfly consciousness in the same way, because there's something about the visible compositionality and about the idea of there being space between subunits that really brings to light all of these contradictory views and just kind of holds a space for them. So I'm not sure if that addresses it either, but I think that's a very exciting question about the scientific epistemology. Sophie?
Yeah, Sophie, please.
Thanks. Open my mind.
So this is a question going back to something you said toward the beginning of the talk. So at one point you mentioned what you called the consequentialist strategy, or the consequentialist approach to deciding whether ant colonies or ants or might be conscious, which would be, we start by figuring out how we should treat them. Or maybe how we do treat them, and then we move from there to a judgment about consciousness. And I guess, and I mean, I wasn't quite clear on the extent to which you were open to this strategy, but it sounded like maybe something you would consider. And I guess I sort of worry that I sort of worry about the viability of this strategy, because it seems like it's clearly not applicable in other cases. So, like, let's say somebody told you, okay, so we have a debate about whether brain dead patients are conscious or not, or like patients with some severe brain disorder are conscious or not. But we have a shortage of organs for donation in the United States, and if the government decided that people with this condition weren't conscious, we wouldn't have a shortage of organs anymore. So then we can, so therefore these people aren't conscious. Clearly, I think we would all be like, no, you can't do that. The judgment of consciousness has to come before the moral decision making. And I guess I guess my question then would be, I mean, do you think that worry is applicable to the consequentialist strategy in the case of ant colonies? And if not, what makes ant colonies different?
Great question. I think that is exactly it. Whether the cart will be before the horse, whether truth or at least accuracy will be upstream or downstream of activism, in a sense. Like, someone could think, because of my belief that animals should or should not be eaten, or this type of animal should or should not be eaten, I'm going to seek out and publicize perspectives that support that view. I'm going to suppress as taboo on through illegal views that don't support the conclusions that I want to reach. And we may have a complete unanimous feeling that there are consequences for, like, human decision making, like you brought up. But I think that's part of the danger and the thrill of philosophy, actually, is understanding, well, where is it that we have this quest for truth and understanding, and allow that to take ethics and norms wherever it may go. Like, when does life begin? And then in what situations, for convenience or for other reasons, is the conclusion almost already reached, explicitly or implicitly, and then people cobble together perspectives that support the conclusion that was already reached. And so in the ant colony case, because we don't have that gold standard, it supports a investigatory culture and attitude. Whereas in the human consciousness studies, I often get the sense that there's people who really want to, they might explicitly make an argument like, if we don't have free will, or if we do have free will, then this or that would not, then, you know, but anytime that the premise already includes a conclusion, like, if there isn't free will, then people wouldn't have moral personhood. So here's why I think there is free will. But that's a consequentialist perspective, instead of the person saying, I'm going to have an open investigation into free will, and then I'm going to allow my ethics and norms to follow behind that. So with insects, that like, it's easy to stay within the lines, and just like I brought up, if you want to do a dissection on a small vertebrate, you might need to go through an institutional review panel. But I know that in the years of field work that I did, I collected thousands of nest mates. I never even had to fill out an ethical review at all. So the implicit kind of water that we swim in is that insects do not, and even we can, there's a lot of insect pain research and invertebrate pain research, and people will debate, well, yes, the lobster has nociception, like, it pulls its arm away from a stimuli, but then the question of whether that is pain would get into whether that should have to be arbitrated like vertebrate studies. So again, I don't know, and those, you know, the investigation and the ethics are in a coevolution with each other. But those are very critical questions. I mean, if the pest insects were to have more moral patienthood, it would be a more complex question for agriculturalists, because it would be less like, well, you know, humans have this status, but we could kill as many microbes or as many pests as needed to support human food production. But if someone said that we're going to feed 100 people, but we have to kill this many, maybe 1, maybe 10, maybe 200, people would say, well, no, we should figure out a different way to do this.
All right. So, Luis, please.
Thank you, Daniel. It was very amazing to hear you talk, and especially I think I was surprised by how well versed you are with philosophy. Because the first question I wrote was how philosophy is interesting for an entomologist, right? But that's not what I will ask you here, because you have a lot of philosophical knowledge. So and I think I can press you further with another more interesting question. I was a little bit puzzled by your use of social complexity. Why social category is important for complexity? And maybe you can answer me on how to apply this framework for explaining human consciousness. Because like the connectionist framework also uses the social stuff, social term, but in a very metaphorical way, right? And in the end, you also maybe you touch this point in arguing that maybe the organism is the colony, not the individual ants, right? So we need to think again and reshape our concepts to see where is the individual, where is the stuff with consciousness, right? And that's pretty much my question. So why social is important, and how we can and if we can apply this framework for human consciousness. Is a human body social stuff with neurons and cells and other elements?
Oh, sorry, Daniel, you mute.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
On the social, this I always think of this book by Bruno Latour, Reassembling the Social, and then this is about actor network theory, aka ANT. So it's a fun crossover. I think you're definitely right to talk about connectionism as quasi-social, at least metaphorically social, because it's like saying, well, it's not just the unit, it's something among. So social is something that is among, and so it is intrinsically collective, whereas functionalism might just be focusing on the outputs of a given collective, but complex system studies and connectionism is looking at basically the social, what is shared. And then just as I have always kind of wondered about, even calling the ants or the termites or the honeybees eusocial insects or social already is very theory laden, and it already identifies a level of individuality that is quite constraining. How could it apply to studying human consciousness? Well, within a connectionist frame or not, we have these different axes, like let's say extent of memory, extent of future projection, multimodal integration of inputs, problem solving. I mean, and then starting with just laying them out and not necessarily assuming which moves on which axes or which combinations of values would relate to more or different conscious states. I'm not sure, but those might be some pieces. I think the human social has a higher extent of theory of mind and also self-reflexive identity. What would they think if I were to do this? And the way that our identity becomes reflected and reconstructed through dialogue. I don't think that happens to nestmates in the same way. I don't think that happens to colonies in the same way. So especially when we are looking at human experience and awareness, inner monologue, and self-concept. I think we're going to have a few more propositional narrative elements in our consciousness. However, underneath that, whether it's the spatial or the temporal or the embodied components, I think that is a layer where there will be more similarity amongst different species.
All right. We still have 5 minutes, so I just want to add a little question of my own. It's more, I'm trying to understand, actually. As far as I understood, you are proposing some sort of common ground to evaluate as different cases as colonies of ants and humans and even artificial intelligence or whatnot, to some sort of a common scale, let's say, or I don't know, some sort of a common ground in which, from which we could maybe say something interesting or make some progress into understanding consciousness in those very radically different systems. And my concern maybe is, it seems that whatever you pick to be this common ground seems to be as theory laden as any other thing. So I was like trying to understand what your proposal was. So it's a multi-dimensional kind of approach. So unless you tell me something interesting about the commonalities of all these cases, what we have is not so much something towards some progress in understanding this different phenomena, but some sort of a mapping of the mess. So I was afraid that this multidimensional approach will just offer the mapping of the mess instead of a step forward into proposing a common ground. So how do you answer to that? I mean, can you come up with something that's not theory laden that provides some progress into combining those different things? I mean, thank you.
Okay, I'll try to give a short answer. I think that is a great question, and it's like, oh, if only we could pull back to some level where we could, get above the clouds of philosophy and get above the mess. But I guess as a sort of field researcher, I like sticking with the trouble, and that might be sort of our condition. And the reason why we focused on system measurement theory, even though arguably that has theory latenness as well, is like at least we could trace, which is what Latour advocates for ultimately, we could trace from system to what we measured and how we interpreted the measurements. And theoretical or scientific or just cultural clarity could arise later. But then the skeptic in me says, well, even the clarity wouldn't mean that that was right. I mean, having a society where everybody thought that ant colonies were or weren't conscious wouldn't make it any more different just for them having that opinion. So that is also definitely part of the tension of the social, that just consensus doesn't imply truth. So how can we deal with that? I think we can recognize fundamental theory latenness, be rigorous and explicit with system measurement theory, and then support in the room and over the kind of career timescale conversations and collaborations with the philosophers of science and the entomologists and the computer scientists, and have a more transdisciplinary environment where people are going to be asking basic questions and learning a lot and accelerating their education. And also people are going to be coming up with some real cool advances and different ways to think about things that within a discipline they might not come to. That's where I think like Helen Longano's work on the scientific pluralism was so pivotal for me in my understanding, because each of the disciplines had their story for aggression. I don't think everybody needs to go swap into the philosophy department, but I was just like, this is kind of connecting the dots and giving a yes and raising up everyone's work by showing that it's different views on something that we could have theory about, instead of debating whether it was just this or just that. So just clarity of our investigations and trying to document it from the early curiosity on through the sort of conclusions and the published outcomes, and then just supporting collaborations as maybe this book can do to make that a better environment through time. And then I'm just going to look at Joao's comment. If your work has connections to Paul Preciado in Dysphoria Mundi, I don't know that specifically, but I am going to look it up. It reminded me of his use of a concept to refer to the extended body, differentiating it from the body of modernity or anatomical object, the somatique. He defines the somatique as the living political body, vast and malleable, which functions as a living political archive where forms of power are instituted and dismantled. Are you studying this? Are you going down the same path? I'm going to look up the researcher that you mentioned, but the closest that I come to that, I'll put it in the chat, is by looking at Giorgio Agamben's work, where he traces out the kind of man as political animal and how we have these two word parts for life. We have zoo and bios. We have biology and zoology. And so there's this double nature of our biological self, and then there's the political kind of Aristotle as like man as the political animal. And that is this tension that comes up with the physiological and the consciousness. And then biopolitics and biopower is, is the biological completely describe the political? And all of those kinds of rich questions about that. But
Perfect.
maybe email me, or I'm definitely going to look into that concept. But yes, definitely the body is not a simple place.
The book that I cite, that I reference is from 2023, so it's new, and it's look to me is the same path that you're tracing.
Thank you. That's very cool.
And João Carlos, I'm sorry, I haven't seen your question in the chat, so I'm glad that Daniel did. So, well, I think that's all. We're gonna conclude now the first session of this meeting, and I want to thank again Daniel for accepting the invitation, for being here, and for the very nice talk, and to all the audience. So, thank you all for being here.